Overall, I think that the camera work in our preliminary was good. However, there were one or two occasions that I think we improved. This was generally when the camera moved. The camera moved only once or twice in our preliminary, but in our opening sequence, this is quite a constant part of the production. In the establishing and first shot of our preliminary task, it can be seen that the camera turns and pans up to allow the audience a full view of the office. However, at the end of this shot, the camera has a noticeable jolt as it moves up, creating some inconsistent and less aesthetically pleasing movement. However, I think that we had a lot more control over this in our opening sequence, as we were more careful with the shots. We did pick from multiple takes in the preliminary to decide which was best, and this was the best establishing shot that we had. I think that the smoother equipment that we used for our opening sequence did contribute in making the panning shot smoother, and that we generally needed to be more careful and smoother with the camera work, especially when the camera is not fixed. I think that this was evident in the opening sequence with the more controlled, smoother pans, plus the act of being more careful when filming the establishing shot for our opening sequence, which required a lot of smooth handheld movement, which I think was successful. We also adopted other handheld techniques in our opening sequence, such as the part where Andrew climbs the stairs whilst being followed by the camera. This could also suggest that having the preliminary to practice camera work gave us more confidence to try different techniques that we hadn't used and be more creative with our camera work, having experience with it in the preliminary. Before the preliminary task, I had not heard of the 180-degree rule, but this we did not end up using in the opening sequence. I had heard of some of the other continuity techniques and we did use these. One in particular was match on action. This we did improve on in the opening sequence, I think. In the preliminary, we did try to include this, but it was constructed in a more clumsy and clunky manner, with the editing not being as effective as it could have been, with the close-up being a bit too quick and the phone itself not being introduced from further away for long enough also, reducing the continuity of the preliminary task. But in the opening sequence, this technique was massively improved upon. When Andrew locks the door, we shows that he was going to lock the door, so the continuity at this point was better. We also tried to use a cutaway to give more interest or information to both productions. Coincidentally, they were the same sort of clip. However, I think they were used for different intentions. In the preliminary task, I think that the use of the clock as a cutaway was to add some interest to the scene and give the audience a greater amount of detail to the setting, as well as possibly addressing the ticking noise in the scene too. In the opening sequence itself, the clock was used more to signify time, adding information and developing the plot also, since the clock is reversed, which could add to the fact that Andrew is having some mental trouble in concentrating on the situation before he encounters the entity. Although we didn't seem to find a use for the technique again, adding some more of these cutaways could have added to the continuity in the situation and the overall opening sequence, and add more interest for the viewer, and it would maybe just look more aesthetically pleasing. When creating meaning out of lighting, the well-lit office-type environment was good. However, the lighting could have been more varied to change the atmosphere for different situations, for example, Lord Sweetener's attitude. However, this was something that we did control more in our opening sequence, since we changed the lighting to represent different atmospheres and times. In the opening sequence, we intentionally lowered the saturation of the lighting and gave it a blue hue to change the atmosphere. The blue hue also helps to make the atmosphere seem colder, which is often an aspect associated when encountering something like ghosts. And although the entity in our opening sequence may not be a ghost, it is an interesting idea to adopt when intentionally changing the atmosphere through lighting. However, I think this is a technique that we should try to improve also, since some of the scenes can have parts where the light is too bright or not as effective.